A scared maid in a rain-slick alley, a bleeding king of the city, one kiss to hide his face from killers, and now her lips are the most dangerous secret in town. He buys her debt. He locks the doors. She sets rules. No lies, no touching without consent. Forced to live under his roof, she hears the truth in his nightmares and feels the heat he refuses to name. But the kiss was caught on camera. Someone inside his house wants it leaked. A rival wants the weakness. A fake delivery turns into gunfire. She won't break. She makes a plan. It backfires. Taken to the river at 3 a.m., blade at her throat, she does the impossible again, steps into him, whispers, "Stay still," and turns a kiss into a shield while the world explodes around them. Now the city knows there's a line he'll kill for, and a girl who won't run. When every gun is pointed at their mouths and the clock is running out, will this one kiss save a kingdom, or start the war that burns it down? The midnight rain drummed against the metal dumpsters, casting silver sheets across the alley behind Club Velour. Camille Hart hitched the heavy trash bag higher, her sensible shoes splashing through puddles as she made her way to the bins. The wet newspaper beneath her feet turned to mush, threatening to slip her with each step. A crackle of radio static froze her mid-stride. "West perimeter. Target spotted." The words scattered on the wind, followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting pavement. That's when she saw him, a dark figure pressed against the brick wall, one hand clutched to his side. Even in shadow, the wet sheen on his fingers was unmistakably blood. Their eyes met. His were dark, dangerous, holding secrets she knew better than to ask about. The sound of footsteps grew closer, echoing off the narrow walls of the alley. Without thinking, Camille dropped the trash bag and closed the distance between them. "Stay still," she whispered, gripping his expensive lapels. His breath hitched as she pressed against him, using her body to shield his face from view. The kiss was desperate, messy, nothing like the romantic moments she'd imagined for herself. His lips were firm but unmoving against hers, his entire body rigid with tension. She could taste copper and rain. Boots splashed past them. Someone muttered, "Just another couple." Before the footsteps faded around the corner, Camille broke away, fumbling for her keycard with trembling fingers. "Inside, quick." She swiped them through the staff entrance, the lock clicking open with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet alley. The service corridor was dark, their wet shoes squeaking against the linoleum as she led him toward the kitchen. Fluorescent lights hummed to life, harsh and revealing. Under the unforgiving glare, she could finally see him clearly, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than she made in a year. Blood had soaked through his white shirt on his left side. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to a steel prep table. He looked like a man unused to taking commands, but pain won out over pride. He perched on the edge while she retrieved the first aid kit from beside the fire extinguisher. "You were ambushed?" she asked, snapping on latex gloves and cutting away the fabric around his wound. A bullet grazed, angry and deep, but not life-threatening. "A meeting went badly." His voice was like gravel, rough with pain or maybe just natural texture. "You should forget you saw me." Camille cleaned the wound with steady hands, years of patching up her own injuries, making her movements efficient. "That would be easier if you tell me who you are." "Salvatore," he said after a long pause. "That's all you need to know." She had just finished the last neat stitch when headlights swept across the windows facing the staff entrance. Two shadowy figures paused at the door, their silhouettes dark against the frosted glass. Camille's heart hammered. Without a word, she helped Salvatore off the table and hustled him into the dry goods pantry. The space was tight, filled with shelves of pasta and canned tomatoes. She could feel the heat of him against her back as she eased the door nearly shut, leaving just enough space to peer out. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted footsteps moving past the pantry, heading toward the main dining room. 5, 6, 7, 8. They passed the bar. 9, 10. Turning down the hall to the offices. Only when silence returned did she let out the breath she'd been holding. "Clear," she whispered, stepping back to let him out. A black sedan pulled silently into the loading bay, its engine a low purr in the night. Salvatore straightened his ruined jacket, every movement controlled despite the pain she knew he must be feeling. "You will be safe if you keep quiet," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. It wasn't quite a threat, but the weight of promise in his words made her shiver. Camille watched from the kitchen door as he limped to the car, his tall frame folding into the back seat with careful precision. The sedan pulled away, tires silent on the wet pavement, and disappeared into the night like a ghost. The clock above the prep table ticked past 1:10 a.m. In the harsh fluorescent light, Camille stared at her blood-stained hands. She moved to the deep sink, turning the hot water on full blast. Steam rose as she scrubbed, watching red swirl down the drain until the water ran clear. Her mind replayed the kiss, not the passionate encounter it must have looked like to the searchers, but a desperate gambit born of quick thinking. Yet her lips still tingled with the memory of his, and her hands remembered the solid warmth of his chest beneath expensive wool. She dried her hands on a clean towel and did one final sweep of the kitchen, wiping away any trace that might betray what had happened. The first aid kit went back in its place, bloody gauze buried deep in the trash. She gathered her coat and bag, checking twice to ensure all doors were locked. The rain had thinned to a fine mist as she headed for the bus stop, her sensible shoes quiet on the wet sidewalk. The night felt different now, charged with possibilities she'd never considered before. But Camille pushed those thoughts away, focusing instead on practical things: the early shift tomorrow, bills to pay, the normal rhythm of her carefully ordered life. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that her world had shifted somehow in that rain-slicked alley, tilted on its axis by a kiss meant only as camouflage and the weight of dark eyes that had seen too much. The pre-dawn air bit through Camille's thin jacket as she approached the club at 5:40 a.m. Her eyes felt like sandpaper after tossing and turning for what little sleep she'd managed. Every time she drifted off, she jolted awake, remembering the press of a stranger's lips against hers. It meant nothing, she muttered, fumbling with her keycard. Just survival instinct. The kitchen lights flickered to life under her touch. She tied on her apron, trying to lose herself in the familiar routine of morning prep. But as she wiped down counters, her hands remembered the feel of expensive wool beneath them, the solid warmth of his chest. By noon, the usual quiet efficiency of the club staff had dissolved into whispers and darting glances. Something was different. Wrong. "Did you hear?" Lisa from the bar leaned close during Camille's break. "Something big went down last night. Marco saw blood on the loading dock." Camille's stomach clenched. Probably just wine someone spilled. "Mr. Reynolds wants to see you." One of the security guards appeared at her elbow. "His office. Now." The walk up the curved staircase felt endless. When she opened the heavy oak door, her heart stopped. Mr. Reynolds sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable, but it was the man standing by the window that drew her eye. Salvatore. In daylight, he was even more imposing, tall and precise in a charcoal suit that emphasized broad shoulders. His face could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and cold perfection. Only his eyes, glacier blue and intent, showed any warmth as they met hers. "Miss Hart." Reynolds shuffled papers nervously. "There's been a development regarding your mother's outstanding debt to the club." Camille's fingers twisted in her apron. The debt had been crushing her for 2 years, every spare penny going to pay off her mother's final hospital bills that the club had covered. "The debt has been settled," Salvatore said, his voice that same rough whisper she remembered. "In full." "I don't understand." But she did. The weight of his gaze told her everything. "You're being reassigned," Reynolds continued, "effective immediately. Private household staff position." "I decline." Camille lifted her chin. "I appreciate the offer, but—" Salvatore moved then, crossing the room in 2 fluid strides. He bent close, his breath warm against her ear. "The men who hunted me last night saw your face. You cannot walk these streets unguarded." Ice slid down her spine. "For how long?" "As long as necessary." The rest of the day passed in a blur. She was given an hour to collect essentials from her apartment, a black SUV idling at the curb while she packed a bag with shaking hands. By dusk, they pulled up to a towering townhouse. Security cameras tracked their movement through wrought iron gates. Armed guards nodded as they passed, their eyes sharp and assessing. Inside, 2 men waited in the marble foyer. The first was lean and weathered, with the quiet competence of a career soldier. "Caleb Moretti," he introduced himself, handing her a keycard. "Head of security." The second man was older, elegant in an expensive suit. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he studied her. "Eamon Doyle, welcome to the household." Camille was led to a guest room larger than her entire apartment. Cream walls, plush carpet, a bed that could sleep 4. She sent a quick text to her landlord, not coming back tonight, we'll explain soon, and began unpacking her meager belongings. Her uniform looked shabby, hanging in the massive closet. She told herself this was temporary, just until whatever danger had brought her here passed, a day or two at most. Night crept in as she stood at the window, watching the city lights blink on. A patrol car glided past the gates, its presence both reassuring and unsettling. In the glass, a reflection appeared, Salvatore in the hallway behind her, his expression unreadable in the dimness. "Sleep," he said simply. "We talk at breakfast." His footsteps faded down the hall, leaving Camille alone with her thoughts and the growing darkness beyond the glass. She pressed her forehead to the cool window, watching her breath fog the pristine surface. Everything had changed in less than 24 hours. A kiss that wasn't really a kiss, a debt erased with suspicious ease. And now this gilded cage, with its armed guards and security cameras and men who spoke in careful undertones. The bed, when she finally lay down, was too soft. The sheets smelled of lavender and wealth. Camille stared at the shadowed ceiling, remembering the weight of Salvatore's words in Reynolds' office. As long as necessary. She wondered what metric they would use to measure necessity, what price this protection would ultimately cost. Outside her door, footsteps passed at regular intervals, guards making their rounds, the whisper of cameras tracking movement, the subtle hum of a security system worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime. All of it meant to keep threats out, or perhaps to keep her in. Her uniform hung in the closet like a ghost of her old life, a life that seemed to be slipping away with each tick of the elegant clock on her nightstand. Tomorrow would bring answers, Salvatore had promised. But as exhaustion finally pulled her under, Camille wasn't sure she was ready for what those answers might reveal. The dining room, stretched before Camille like a museum piece, all dark wood and crystal chandeliers. At 7:15 a.m., sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished table where she sat, hands folded in her lap. Salvatore stood at the head of the table, his presence filling the room. "There are rules," he said, voice clipped. "Non-negotiable. You don't leave without an escort. All calls go through the house line. And above all," his eyes locked onto hers, "no lies." Camille met his gaze steadily. "I have conditions too." A muscle ticked in his jaw, but he nodded. "No locked doors when we speak, no touching without my permission." She drew a breath. "And I promise to tell you if anyone asks about last night. But that goes both ways. I need to know if I'm in real danger." Surprise flickered across his face, there and gone. Agreed. He assigned her to the house staff, explaining her duties would mirror her work at the club, cleaning, laundry, kitchen help, normal tasks in an abnormal setting. Caleb appeared at her elbow after breakfast, his presence steady as he walked her through the house. "Panic buttons here," he said, indicating discreet panels in the corridors. "Blind spots in the cameras there and there." He showed her each security feature with methodical patience. The morning settled into a rhythm. Camille counted sheets in the linen closet, noting the woman working beside her, Maria, according to her badge, watched Camille's hands more than her face. The observation nagged at her as she moved through her tasks. In the kitchen, she helped prep lunch ingredients, learning the patterns of deliveries and meal times. Dust cloths revealed the traces of life in empty rooms. A coffee ring here, a scattered paperclip there. Each detail built a map in her mind of how the household breathed. After lunch, Camille passed Eamon's study. He sat reviewing security footage on his tablet, and she caught a glimpse of grainy black and white images from the club's alley. Her heart stuttered. Had the camera captured that desperate kiss? "Poor angle," Eamon murmured. But his gaze lingered too long on the timestamp. Something in his expression made her skin prickle. The afternoon sun was sinking when Camille carried tea to Salvatore's office. She noticed his hand tremor as he signed documents. Just once, quickly masked. A crack in his perfect control. He dismissed her without looking up, but that brief glimpse of vulnerability stayed with her. At 10:30 p.m., Camille lay in her bed, hyper-aware of the wall separating her room from Salvatore's. The house had settled into night quiet, broken only by the soft tread of security patrols. A muffled sound came from next door, sheets rustling, a sharp intake of breath, Salvatore's voice rough with sleep. "Marco." The name held such pain it made her chest ache, then silence fell again, heavy with untold stories. Camille stared into the darkness, piecing together the day's fragments. Maria's furtive glances, Eamon's studied interest in the security footage, that single trembling hand. A name spoken in nightmare. Each detail felt significant, but she couldn't see the pattern yet. The ceiling fan turned lazy circles overhead. Outside, crickets chirped in the manicured gardens. Guards made their rounds, radios crackling softly. All the trappings of safety, yet uncertainty gnawed at her edges. She'd traded one form of confinement for another, debt for protection. But protection from what? The men who'd hunted Salvatore, or something else entirely? The questions chased themselves in circles as she listened to the house breathe around her. The panic buttons Caleb had shown her glowed faintly in the dark, tiny red eyes watching over her sleep. She thought of Maria's downturned face, of Eamon's calculating stare, of that name, Marco, weighted with grief. Somewhere in this maze of power and secrets lay answers, but for now all she could do was observe and wait. A clock ticked steadily down the hall, marking time in this gilded cage. Camille traced the day's events like worry beads. The rules laid down, the boundaries drawn, the small revelations that might mean everything or nothing. Sleep remained elusive as she lay in sheets too fine for comfort, listening to the quiet that had fallen over Salvatore's room. Tomorrow would bring new routines to learn, new details to catalog. But tonight she was acutely conscious of her position, a maid turned witness, caught in currents she barely understood. The protection offered felt both genuine and constraining, like being wrapped in silk that could turn to steel. The night deepened, security cameras whirred on their mounts. Somewhere, guards watched monitors showing empty corridors, and Camille remained awake, separated from the most dangerous man she'd ever met by nothing more than a wall and a promise of safety that grew more complex with each passing hour. Dawn crept through the curtains, painting strips of pale gold across Camille's floor. She'd barely slept, the weight of yesterday's revelations heavy on her mind. The house was quiet save for the soft footsteps of the morning security rotation. She padded down to the kitchen, drawn by the need for coffee and normalcy. Voices drifted from around the corner, Salvatore's low rumble and Caleb's measured tones. She paused, not meaning to eavesdrop, but frozen by their words. The rear route was mapped perfectly, Caleb was saying. They knew exactly when and where to position their men. Inside information, Salvatore's voice held deadly calm. Has to be. Someone in the household sold your schedule. Camille's blood ran cold. If they knew Salvatore's movements, they knew about the alley. About her. The coffee forgotten, she retreated silently to her room. Her hands shook as she pulled out a small tote bag. Essential items only. ID, cash, a change of clothes. The women's shelter downtown took walk-ins, no questions asked. She could disappear before anyone realized she was gone. The morning sun cast long shadows as she approached the front gate. Freedom beckoned beyond the iron bars, but Caleb materialized from the guard station, his expression gentle but immovable. "There's a bullet out there with your name on it now," he said quietly. "But in here," he gestured to the house, "in here is the devil who won't let that bullet find you." Movement caught her eye. Above them, Salvatore stood on the balcony, his face an expressionless mask. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away. "Prepare the second guest room next to mine," his voice carried down. "Ms. Hart will be moving closer." Proximity as both control and protection. The message was clear. She was too valuable to leave, too vulnerable to trust with distance. The day passed in a blur of relocated belongings and reorganized routines. Camille's new room shared a wall with Salvatore's suite, the space elegant but clearly designed for surveillance. The windows overlooked the secured courtyard instead of the street. She tried to focus on her duties, but awareness of the threat lurked at the edges of her mind. Every shadow might hide a gunman. Every friendly face could mask betrayal. The quiet efficiency of the household felt like a facade concealing deadly currents. In the late afternoon, Maria from the linen department passed close while Camille folded sheets. A piece of paper slipped from her hand to the pile of laundry. Camille waited until she was alone to unfold it. 5 words in neat handwriting. "Do you know what he is?" She didn't hesitate. The note went into tiny pieces and disappeared down the toilet. Evidence erased of whatever game Maria was playing. Whether warning or trap, Camille wouldn't be drawn in. The evening settled heavily around the house. Security lights came on in the gardens, and the night shift took their positions. Camille sat in her new room, listening to the familiar sounds of Salvatore moving in the suite next door. At 9:00 p.m., a sound broke the quiet. Ragged breathing, sheets rustling, the unmistakable distress of another nightmare. Camille found herself outside his door, hand raised to knock. The man who commanded such power and fear, brought low by his own demons. But she let her hand fall. Whatever haunted his dreams wasn't hers to witness or heal. Instead, she pressed closer to the door and whispered the words that had saved them both that first night. "Stay still." Then she turned away, padding back to her room. Above her, the hallway camera blinked once, its red light steady as it recorded her retreat. The night wrapped around the house like a shroud. Somewhere in the darkness, enemies plotted and traitors moved pieces on an invisible board. But here, in this strange space between captivity and sanctuary, Camille chose to stay still, caught between the devil she knew and the bullets she didn't. Guards patrolled the perimeter, radios crackling with coded check-ins. The security system hummed, cameras watching every angle. In her new room, Camille could hear Salvatore's breathing, even out as his nightmare passed. She lay in bed, processing the day's revelations. Someone in the household had betrayed Salvatore. Maria was either trying to warn her or entrap her, and the man whose protection she now depended on was both her greatest danger and her only shield. The walls of her gilded cage had drawn closer, but they'd also grown stronger. Every restriction came with a layer of security, every rule designed to keep her alive. She was a witness now, a potential target, and something else she couldn't quite define. Something that made Salvatore move her closer instead of disposing of the liability she represented. Through the wall, she heard him shift in his sleep and wondered if he could hear her too. Distance and proximity, protection and control, devil and guardian. The lines blurred more with each passing hour. The camera in the hallway kept its silent vigil, recording every movement, every whispered word, every choice made in the dark. Whatever game was being played, whatever forces were moving against them, Camille was now irrevocably part of the story. The only question was whether she would survive its telling. The morning sun cast long shadows through the dining room windows as Camille picked at her breakfast. Across the table, Salvatore's presence commanded attention even in silence. At precisely 8:05 a.m., he began outlining her new reality. "You'll have rotating security escorts," he said, his voice steady and methodical. "Two-man teams, changed every 8 hours, learn their faces, trust no one else." Camille set down her fork. And inside the house, panic buttons are in every room, press twice for immediate response. He slid a small remote across the table. "The main alarm has 3 tones. For the third, the continuous one, you go directly to the pantry safe room. No questions, no delays." "The pantry where I hid you?" A hint of irony touched her voice. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Yes, reinforced steel behind the shelving. Keypad code is your birth date." She touched the remote, feeling its weight. Another tether, another reminder of her changed circumstances. "If you want my silence," she said carefully, "I need one thing in return." Salvatore waited, his stillness more unnerving than any threat. "Treat me like a person, not a debt you've purchased." She met his gaze steadily. "I saved your life because it was right, not because I owed you anything." For a long moment he studied her, then a single nod, subtle but decisive. Later that morning, he summoned her to his office. The wound in his side needed checking, and she was the only one he'd allowed near it since that night. She entered to find him standing by the window, jacket already removed. He unbuttoned his shirt with deliberate precision, each movement measured and controlled. The air grew, thick with unspoken tension as more skin was revealed. The graze along his ribs was healing clean, but angry red against his olive skin. Camille kept her movements clinical as she examined the stitches. His breathing remained steady, but she felt the heat radiating from his body, saw the slight tension in his jaw. Neither acknowledged the charge building between them, the dangerous current that hummed whenever they were this close. "It's healing well," she said, stepping back to a professional distance. "Another week before the stitches can come out." He nodded, rebuilding his armor one button at a time. The moment passed, but its echo lingered in the air. The afternoon found Camille in the linen closet, counting sheets and towels with mechanical precision. Her attention caught on the keycard log, 2 cards signed out to staff profiles she didn't recognize. After 3 days of memorizing every face, every schedule, the anomaly set off warning bells. She found Caleb in the security office reviewing camera feeds. "The spare key cards," she said without preamble. "Profiles C17 and D23. Who are they?" His frown was immediate and concerning. "Show me!" She led him to the log, watching as he traced the entries with a finger. "I'll check the access records," he said finally. "Good catch, stay alert." The rest of the day passed in routine tasks, but Camille felt the underlying current of tension. Every shadow seemed deeper, every unexpected sound more ominous. The house held its secrets close, and she was learning to read its whispers. Night fell early, bringing with it a thick fog that cloaked the grounds in mystery. Camille was preparing for bed when she heard soft footsteps in the foyer below. unusual for this hour. The intercom buzzed, breaking the quiet. "Courier service," a man's voice crackled through the speaker. "Sent by the tailor!" Something felt wrong. Deliveries came during day shifts through verified channels. Camille moved to the stairs, drawn by instinct more than thought. She was halfway down when Salvatore emerged from his study, his movements casual but alert. As he reached for the door, Camille saw what he couldn't. The security monitor reflecting 3 figures instead of 1, their stances too rigid for simple delivery men. Time slowed. Salvatore's hand touched the door handle. The night air whispered through the gap. And there, unmistakable in the porch light's glow, came the metallic glint of a gun emerging from beneath a jacket. The scene froze in terrible clarity. Salvatore's profile calm and unaware, the door swinging wider, 3 shadows moving with deadly purpose, and the weapon catching light like a star falling toward Earth. The clock on the wall clicked to 12:03 a.m., marking the moment when peace shattered and chaos rushed in. Camille's heart pounded against her ribs, each beat stretching the seconds into eternity. The stairs beneath her feet felt both solid and insubstantial, like a bridge between 2 worlds. The one where she was safe under Salvatore's protection, and the one now crashing through their door with violence in its hands. The foyer lights cast sharp shadows across the marble floor, creating a stark tableau of the moment. Every detail burned into her memory. The slight condensation on the glass panels beside the door. The way Salvatore's shirt pulled across his shoulders as he reached forward. The soft click of expensive shoes on stone as the men crossed the threshold. Security cameras whirred silently in their corners, recording what might be their last moments of peace. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence that hung suspended in that frozen instant. Through the open door, fog curled around the men's ankles like ghostly chains, binding them all to whatever fate waited on the other side of this moment. The gun's barrel caught another flash of light, a deadly promise waiting to be fulfilled. The violence exploded like a thunderclap in the marble foyer. In one fluid motion, Salvatore yanked the heavy door forward as a shield, his other hand already drawing his weapon. The first shot cracked through the night air, and the lead attacker dropped with mechanical precision, a red bloom spreading across his chest. "Down!" Caleb's voice cut through the chaos as he materialized from the shadows, pulling Camille behind the solid oak banister. Her back hit the wood hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, but she barely felt it, her senses overwhelmed by the sharp tang of gunpowder and the controlled fury of movement before her. The second attacker rushed forward, desperation making him sloppy. Salvatore moved like water, catching the man's gun arm and twisting with brutal efficiency. The crack of breaking bone cut through the air, followed by a strangled scream that died in a wet gurgle as Salvatore fired point blank. Time stretched like taffy, each second crystal clear yet somehow blurred. Camille saw the third shooter emerge from the fog, silenced pistol rising with deadly intent. Salvatore pivoted, placing his body between the gun and Camille, his movement precise, despite the weight of the second body still falling. The fight ended as suddenly as it began. 2 bodies lay still on the imported marble, and the third attacker fled into the mist, leaving only footprints in the dew-wet grass. The acrid smell of bleach cut through the gunpowder haze as house staff materialized with cleaning supplies, working with practiced efficiency. Camille's hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists. When Salvatore reached for her, concern etched in the hard lines of his face. She straightened her spine. "Don't worry about me," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "Tell me where to wipe." His expression shifted, something dark and approving flickering in his eyes. He nodded once and directed her to a section of wall where blood had sprayed in an arc. She worked methodically, shoulder to shoulder, with the other staff, while trusted cleaners in unmarked vans removed the bodies through a discreet service entrance. The police patrol car made its scheduled pass at 1:15 a.m., its headlights sweeping across pristine marble and professionally neutral faces. Inside, the house hummed with contained tension, every person moving with purpose, erasing evidence of the violence that had erupted in their sanctuary. Salvatore approached as Camille finished her section, his presence a wall of heat at her back. He leaned close, his forehead nearly touching hers, breath warm against her ear. "Don't look," he murmured, but it was too late. She'd already seen everything. The efficiency of his violence, the way he'd positioned himself to protect her, the aftermath of what men could do to each other. "I won't pretend I didn't," she replied, turning to meet his gaze. Something shifted in the space between them, an acknowledgement of shared darkness. By 2 a.m., the house settled into an uneasy quiet. The marble gleamed as if nothing had happened, but Camille could still see the echoes of violence in every shadow. Sleep was impossible, adrenaline still singing through her veins. She found herself on the balcony, hands gripping the cool iron rail, watching the city lights blur through the dissipating fog. The night air carried the metallic tang of coming rain, washing away the last traces of gunpowder and bleach. Below, guards moved in revised patterns, their vigilance heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car horn seemed magnified in the pre-dawn stillness. Camille stood her vigil as the stars faded and the eastern sky began to lighten. At 6:12 a.m., the first rays of sunlight struck the city's glass towers, sending sheets of gold cascading across the awakening streets. The light crept into the courtyard below, where Salvatore stood at the outdoor sink, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. She watched as he methodically washed his forearms, the water running pink then clear. His movements were precise, almost meditative, as if this too was a ritual he knew well. The morning light caught the water droplets, turning them to diamonds against his skin, a beautiful contrast to the violence they washed away. The scene below captured everything about this new world she'd entered. The brutal efficiency, the careful cleanup, the way darkness and light twisted together until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Salvatore's hands, capable of both protection and destruction, now clean but no less dangerous. The city continued to wake around them, traffic building on distant streets, early workers hurrying to their normal lives. But here, in this protected pocket of space, time seemed suspended, between night and day, between violence and peace. Camille remained at her post, watching the man below finish his ablutions, understanding that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The sun climbed higher, warming the cool marble beneath her feet. Below, Salvatore dried his hands with methodical care, each movement controlled and purposeful. The water in the sink had run clear, but Camille knew the truth of what had happened would always linger in the spaces between heartbeats, in the shadows that stretched across polished floors, in the way she now understood that safety and danger could wear the same face. The morning sun had fully crested when Camille stepped onto the balcony at 6:20 a.m., carrying a tray with steaming tea and medical supplies. Salvatore stood at the railing, his white shirt still rolled at the elbows, revealing forearms corded with tension. He didn't turn, but his shoulders shifted slightly, acknowledging her presence. "You should rest," he said, voice rough from the long night. "So should you." Camille set the tray on the small table. "But first, let me check those stitches." He faced her then, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. After a moment's hesitation, he unbuttoned his shirt with measured movements. The morning light caught the ladder of scars climbing his left side, parallel to the fresh wound she'd stitched in the club kitchen. As she cleaned around the healing gash, her fingers brushed one of the old scars. "These weren't from the same fight." "No!" The word came out clipped, but then he surprised her by continuing. "That was before, when I was younger, more trusting." Camille kept her touch gentle as she applied fresh gauze, giving him space to find the words. "My brother," he said finally, the syllables falling like stones. "Marco. He was 23. There was a woman, planted by Santino's father. She made him believe—" He stopped, jaw working. "When Marco figured it out, tried to warn me, they were waiting. The trap wasn't even for him. It was meant for me." Camille secured the bandage, her hands steady despite the weight of his confession. "And you learned not to trust tenderness." "I learned to make it armor instead." His fingers caught her wrist as she withdrew, the touch light but deliberate. "Last night, when you didn't run or scream—" "Tenderness isn't weakness," she said, meeting his gaze. "It's aim. You protected me before you fired. That's not weakness, it's knowing exactly what matters." His eyes dropped to her mouth, dark with something that made her pulse skip. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he released her wrist and stepped back. "Eat something," he ordered, voice rough. "You're swaying." The day settled into familiar patterns, as if trying to paint over the violence with routine. Workers arrived to repair the foyer's damaged molding, their tools a steady rhythm against the marble. A legitimate courier delivered suits and shirts, the packages carefully inspected before being carried upstairs. In the security office, Caleb hunched over computer screens, methodically reviewing staff keycard logs. Eamon drifted in and out, speaking casually about increasing external patrols and adding cameras to the perimeter. "The breach was internal," Caleb said quietly when Eamon had gone, "but he keeps looking outward." Camille filed that away as she continued her rounds, dusting surfaces that didn't need it, straightening items that were already aligned. Her body ached with exhaustion, but sleep felt impossible. At 4:30, a house guard brought her a small package that had arrived with the afternoon mail. Her name was printed in block letters, no return address. Inside, Nested in brown paper sat a prepaid phone. The screen lit up as soon as she touched it, displaying a single video file. Her hands trembled as she pressed play. The footage was grainy, shot from above. The alley behind the club, the desperate kiss she'd used to shield Salvatore's face from his hunters. A text message popped up. Send his meeting schedule for Friday, or this goes to Santino. Camille's throat went tight. She powered off the phone and buried it at the bottom of her cleaning caddy, beneath rags and spray bottles. This was her mess to fix. Salvatore had enough targets on his back without adding another because of her impulsive decision in that alley. She moved through her evening tasks on autopilot, mind racing through possibilities. The video was leverage, yes, but also proof that someone had been watching the club that night. Someone who knew where to find her now. By 10:40, she'd retreated to her room, the burner phone a silent weight across the hall in the supply closet. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, whispering promises to herself that she'd handle it in the morning. Find a way to protect him as he'd protected her. Outside in the hallway, a security camera's LED glowed steady red, watching her door. The house settled around her, creaking quietly as it cooled in the night air. Somewhere below, guards made their rounds, keys jingling softly. The illusion of safety wrapped around her like a blanket, even as plans and contingencies chased themselves through her mind. She could feel the phantom weight of that phone, humming with threat and possibility. The video it contained could destroy the careful balance of power, could paint Salvatore as vulnerable, could get him killed, like his brother, if she didn't find a way to contain it. The clock on her nightstand ticked steadily toward 11. Down the hall, a door opened and closed. Salvatore's measured footsteps crossing to his own room. The wall between them felt paper-thin, charged with unspoken words and careful distances. She wondered if he was remembering the kiss as she was, not just as strategy, but as a moment when barriers had crumbled. Camille pulled the covers tighter, trying to quiet her racing thoughts. Morning would come soon enough, bringing decisions and consequences. For now, she lay in the dark, listening to the house breathe around her, the burner phone waiting like a live wire in her cleaning caddy across the hall. The morning sun cast long shadows across the linen room. As Camille methodically folded towels, her mind churning over how to handle the burner phone's threat. She needed a schedule, something believable enough to trade for that video. Maybe Caleb would have blank forms she could. Voices drifted through the partially open door, making her hands still. Postponing Friday's meeting shows weakness, Salvatore's low tone carried clearly. Ilya Petrov is a crucial import partner, Eamon replied smoothly. But these leaks make you mortal, sir. Perhaps a delay until we plug the holes. The way he said mortal hung in the air, both warning and challenge wrapped in silk. Camille's fingers tightened on the towel she held. Through the morning, she watched staff patterns with new eyes. The quiet linens maid, Maria, kept glancing at Camille's pockets during lunch, expectation clear in her gaze. Someone was waiting for her to carry that burner, to make the expected move. Well, she'd move first. The security alcove sat empty at 4:15 p.m., screens glowing with camera feeds. Camille's hands trembled as she navigated the computer system, creating a schedule template. She filled it with carefully altered routes and meeting times, just plausible enough to seem real, just wrong enough to be useless. Footsteps approached. She quickly switched screens to the pantry inventory system. Everything all right? Caleb asked from the doorway. Just printing inventory sheets, she said, gesturing at the screen. Running low on cleaning supplies. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded and continued down the hall. Camille let out a slow breath, her heart hammering. The fake schedule printed silently beside her. The afternoon crept by in a haze of routine tasks. At 7, she slipped out to the staff entrance, tucking a note under the worn rubber mat. Midnight. Club Alley. The burner phone pressed against her arm, hidden in her sleeve. Rain started falling as evening settled over the house. Camille went through her usual nighttime routine, changing into sleep clothes, turning down her bed, setting out tomorrow's uniform. At 11:45, she pulled on dark clothes and a heavy coat, sliding the burner back into her sleeve. The staff gate's hinges were freshly oiled, silent as she eased it open. Caleb would think she was safely in bed. She'd made sure he saw her heading upstairs earlier. Cold drizzle beaded on her coat as she hurried toward the bus stop, the city clock tower beginning to toll the midnight hour. Her footsteps echoed on the wet pavement. The streets were nearly empty, sodium lights casting orange pools through the mist. A cat darted across her path, making her jump. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. The fake schedule crinkled in her pocket as she walked. It was a desperate gamble, trading false information for that damning video. But she had to try. had to protect Salvatore from this new threat, the way he'd protected her. Wind whipped down the avenue, carrying the scent of rain and wet asphalt. The bus stop's plastic shelter offered little protection as she waited, checking her watch repeatedly. The night bus was running late. Her mind kept circling back to that conversation she'd overheard. Eamon's careful words about mortality and weakness, the way he'd looked at the security footage timestamps that first day, how eager he seemed to focus on external threats rather than internal betrayal. Finally, headlights cut through the drizzle. The bus wheezed to a stop, doors folding open with a hiss. Camille climbed aboard, dropping coins into the fare box. Only 3 other passengers rode at this hour, an elderly man dozing in the back, a woman in scrubs probably heading to a hospital shift, and a teenager with headphones. As the bus lurched into motion, she pressed her forehead against the cool window. Streets slid past in a blur of neon and shadow. The fake schedule felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. She'd filled it with carefully crafted lies, wrong times, altered routes, false meeting points. Enough truth mixed in to seem legitimate at first glance. The closer they got to the club, the tighter her chest felt. She was gambling everything on this play, if she was wrong about who was behind the threats, if she'd misjudged the situation. But she couldn't sit passive, waiting for others to decide her fate. She'd chosen to help Salvatore that first night in the alley. Now she had to follow through, had to protect what that choice had started. The bus driver called her stop. Camille stood, steadying herself on the rail as they pulled to the curb. The doors opened onto empty sidewalks, slick with rain. She stepped out into the night, the burner phone a constant presence against her arm. Through the drizzle, she could make out the club's dark bulk ahead. Security lights cast weak halos in the mist. The employee entrance would be locked this late, but she knew the service alley, knew exactly where she'd first kissed a dangerous man to save his life. The city clock tower told its final midnight stroke as she approached the alley's mouth. Water dripped from fire escapes above, creating phantom footsteps that made her twitch. The fake schedule crinkled as she touched her pocket for reassurance. She paused at the alley's entrance, rain beating on her coat. The same sodium light buzzed overhead, casting more shadows than illumination. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, someone waited with a video that could destroy everything. Drawing a deep breath, Camille stepped into the alley. The drizzle continued falling, soft and steady, as the clock tower's final toll faded into silence. The alley stretched empty before her, water dripping from the fire escape overhead in a steady metronome of tension. Camille checked her phone, 12:05 a.m., the blue light illuminating her worried face for a brief second before she tucked it away. Sirens wailed somewhere in the city, their mournful sound echoing off brick walls slick with rain. A distant warning she should have heeded hours ago. Movement caught her eye. A familiar figure emerged from the shadows, the quiet linens maid from the house, her petite frame suddenly menacing in the half-light. Her usual demure expression was gone, replaced by something harder, hungrier. 2 men flanked her, unfamiliar faces with cold eyes and bulges beneath their jackets. Not Salvatore's people. These men carried themselves differently, less disciplined but more eager. "The schedule," the maid demanded, hand extended, palm up like she was collecting a debt long overdue. "The real one, now." "Show me the video first," Camille countered, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart hammering against her ribs. She planted her feet, refusing to show the fear crawling up her spine. One of the men pulled out a phone, turning it to display the grainy footage from that first night. The kiss that had saved Salvatore's life flickered on the screen, tender, desperate, revealing. The kiss that now threatened to destroy everything if it fell into the wrong hands. "You're his weakness," the maid sneered, eyes glittering with triumph. "The perfect leash for the king. Santino Guerra will pay well to see his rival brought low by a maid. A man who can't protect what's his doesn't deserve power." Camille's fingers brushed the decoy schedule in her pocket. She'd spent hours filling it with carefully crafted lies. Just enough truth mixed in to seem legitimate. Details that would lead anyone following it into empty rooms and wasted time. "Delete it! Show me you're deleting it, and the schedule is yours!" Rain pattered steadily as they stared each other down, droplets gathering at the ends of Camille's hair before falling to her shoulders. A car horn blared in the distance, making Camille flinch, her nerves raw and exposed. Before anyone could move, headlights swept the alley entrance, cutting through the darkness like searchlights. A black SUV rolled in, high beams slicing through the misty rain, casting long shadows that danced against the walls. The maid's companions tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons, faces tightening with sudden wariness. A man stepped out, tall, sharp-featured, wearing an expensive coat that repelled water like it knew better than to cling to him. Camille recognized him from conversations overheard in the house, from the way Salvatore's men straightened when he entered rooms. Ilya Petrov, the import partner Eamon had warned about, in hushed, concerned tones. "This grows interesting," Ilya said, his accent subtle but present like expensive cologne. "The king's new pet, out alone at night." His smile didn't reach his eyes as he studied her, assessing her value like merchandise. "And carrying such valuable information." More men emerged from the SUV, guns no longer concealed, metal gleaming dully in the rain. The Maid's group shifted uneasily as the power dynamic tilted, outnumbered and outgunned in seconds. "We had a deal," the Maid protested, her earlier confidence crumbling at the edges. "Plans change," Ilya shrugged, elegant and dismissive. "Markets adjust. Santina will pay more through my channels. The girl and the footage, a perfect package. 2 leverages are better than 1, wouldn't you agree?" Camille's mind raced, scenarios flashing through her thoughts like lightning. She was caught between competing predators, each seeing her as leverage against Salvatore. Gun muzzles pointed her direction as tensions rose, the air electric with potential violence. "The schedule," Ilya commanded, extending his hand, manicured fingers beckoning. "Don't make this messier than it needs to be." Rain dripped down Camille's neck as she weighed impossible options, each worse than the last. The fake schedule might buy time, but these people would kill her once they discovered the deception. Running wasn't possible, not with armed men boxing her in against wet brick walls. Tires whispered on wet concrete behind them, almost silent but unmistakable. Another vehicle approached, headlights off, presence announced only by the soft displacement of puddles. The assembled group turned, weapons raising, a chorus of metallic clicks as safeties disengaged. A familiar black car glided to a stop, sleek and predatory. The driver's door opened, and Caleb stepped out, face set in grim lines, eyes scanning the scene with practiced efficiency. But it was the passenger door opening that made the temperature seem to plummet, the very air growing heavier. Salvatore emerged into the rain, his presence filling the narrow space like smoke. His expression was terrifyingly calm as he surveyed the scene, taking in every detail without a flicker of emotion. Water beaded on his impeccable suit jacket, but he seemed not to notice, focused entirely on the tableau before him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly through the patter of rain. "Who touches her dies first." The alley held its breath. Rain continued falling, soft and steady, as the night balanced on a knife's edge. No one moved, as if motion itself might trigger the violence hanging in the air. Ilya's men shifted uneasily, exchanging glances loaded with doubt. The Maid's companions looked between their employer and the newcomers, calculating odds that grew worse by the second. Camille stood frozen, feeling the weight of competing interests pressing in around her like a vice. The decoy schedule felt like it was burning through her pocket. She'd tried to handle this alone, to protect Salvatore from this new threat without dragging him into danger. Instead, she'd walked into a trap where everyone wanted to use her against him, turning her attempt at bravery into another problem he had to solve. Salvatore's eyes found hers for a moment, cutting through the space between them. Something flickered in their depths, concern, anger, something else she couldn't name that made her breath catch. Then his attention returned to the others, his stillness more threatening than any movement could be, like a predator deciding which prey to take first. Water dripped steadily from the fire escape above, marking seconds that stretched like hours. Sirens had faded to silence. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would make the first move in this deadly chess game. Ilya's careful smile had vanished, replaced by calculation, wheels turning behind his eyes as he reassessed his position. The Maid's confident sneer wavered as she realized how badly she'd miscalculated, how far out of her depth she'd waited. Everyone in the alley knew that Salvatore's quiet threat wasn't empty words. It was a promise written in rain and shadow, backed by a reputation built on keeping exactly these kinds of promises. The clock tower began to toll 12:14 a.m., its deep notes rolling through the damp air, echoing between buildings. Each toll seemed to increase the tension, like a countdown to violence. Camille could feel it building, see it in the way hands tightened on weapons, in the subtle shifts of stance as everyone prepared for what would come next, in the way breathing grew shallow and eyes darted for cover. Rain continued falling, soft and steady, as Salvatore stood motionless in the alley's mouth. Water ran down his face like tears, catching on the hard line of his jaw before dripping onto his collar, but his eyes were dry and deadly cold, focused on the threats surrounding the woman he'd come to claim. The clock tower's final toll faded into chaos. Motion exploded across the rain-slick alley as Caleb's team emerged from shadows, engaging Ilya's men in a brutal dance of muzzle flashes and breaking glass. The mole bolted, her heels skidding on wet pavement. She made it 3 steps before one of Caleb's men tackled her, both hitting the ground hard. The burner phone skittered across concrete, disappearing into a storm drain. Camille's survival instincts kicked in. She sprinted for the club's side entrance, keycard clutched tight, fingers trembling as she swiped. The door clicked open just as bullets started flying. She dove behind the bar, glass shattering overhead as rounds punctured beer taps. Foam and alcohol rained down, mixing with the water dripping from her clothes. Salvatore appeared beside her in a fluid motion, pressing her against the bar's inner wall. His body covered hers completely, shielding her from flying debris. His breathing came rough and measured as he counted shots, tracking the firefight's rhythm. 8 hostiles, he murmured against her ear. 3 down! Wait for the pattern! His hand found hers in the darkness, pressing cold metal into her palm. A backup pistol, small but deadly. He kept his fingers wrapped around hers on the grip, neither forcing her to shoot nor leaving her defenseless. The choice would be hers, but he'd guide the consequence. Breath steady, he instructed, his voice a low rumble she felt through her back. If you need to fire, we do it. Together. Movement at the club's rear entrance drew their attention. Eamon appeared, weapon raised, taking position near an overturned table. His stance suggested support, but something in his eyes made Camille's skin crawl. The consigliere's lip curled as he adjusted his aim, not toward Ilya's position, but directly at Salvatore's exposed shoulder. A king who bleeds, Eamon snarled, is a king who falls. The betrayal crystallized in a single heartbeat. Yaman's finger tightened on the trigger. Salvatore started to turn, but too late. The shot cracked through the chaos. Salvatore jerked against Camille, a grunt of pain escaping through clenched teeth as the bullet tore into his shoulder. Blood immediately soaked his jacket, hot and sticky against her back. Caleb's return fire drove Eamon behind a column. Through the club's windows, Camille saw Ilya backing toward his vehicle, face calculating as he weighed shifting advantages. Red and blue lights suddenly strobed across wet tile and chrome fixtures. Police sirens wailed closer, multiple units converging on the gunfire reports. Body cameras would soon document everything. Camille made a split-second decision. She turned in Salvatore's arms, ignoring his pained intake of breath, and pressed her mouth to his. "Stay still," she whispered against his lips, using her body to shield his face from the approaching lights. His good hand gripped her waist, understanding instantly. Behind them, Caleb sprinted for the back exit, working to jam the door before police could breach. The main entrance erupted with shouted commands as officers established a perimeter. The side door crashed open. 3 men Camille didn't recognize rushed in, moving with practiced efficiency. Before she could react, rough hands grabbed her arms, dragging her away from Salvatore. She kicked and thrashed, but zip ties bit into her wrists with brutal speed. "No!" Salvatore surged up, face contorted in fury and pain. Blood poured from his shoulder as he tried to stand. Caleb tackled him back down, using his weight to pin his boss. "You'll bleed out," he growled. "She dies if you die here." The last thing Camille saw as they hauled her through the side exit was Salvatore fighting against Caleb's restraining grip, his face a mask of helpless rage. They shoved her into a waiting van, the interior reeking of cigarettes and gun oil. Through the fogged rear windows, police cruisers screamed past, oblivious to the real crime happening in their midst. Rain blurred her final glimpse of the club, Salvatore struggling to his knees, then collapsing back as blood loss won out over will. The van fishtailed away into the darkness, its tires throwing up sheets of water. Camille's bound hands pressed against cold metal as she fought to stay upright through each turn. The digital display on the dash clicked to 12:32 a.m. One of her captors spoke into a phone. Package secured for Santino, en route to secondary location. Camille closed her eyes, forcing down panic. She could still feel Salvatore's blood on her back, still taste his lips from that desperate last kiss. She focused on those sensations, letting them feed, not her fear but her determination. The zip ties were tight, but not circulation cutting tight. These men were professionals, but they weren't Salvatore's caliber. They saw her as a maid, a weak point to exploit. They didn't know she'd already survived one impossible night. Rain drummed on the van's roof as they wound through back streets, avoiding main roads and cameras. Camille kept her breathing steady, just as Salvatore had taught her behind the bar. She might be zip-tied, but her mind was free to work. She memorized every turn, every sound, every snippet of conversation. She'd learned more about survival in the past week than in all her years before. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same clarity that had made her step into that alley in the first place. The van rumbled on through sheets of rain, carrying her deeper into the city's shadows. Behind them, sirens continued to wail, but they were fading now, chasing the wrong targets through the wet night. The single bulb swung lazily overhead, casting shifting shadows across the warehouse's concrete floor. Camille sat with her back straight in the metal chair, refusing to show fear as Santino's lieutenant held up a tablet. The screen displayed a freeze frame of that first desperate kiss in the alley, her hands gripping Salvatore's lapels, his body pressed against the wall. "The boss's leash," the lieutenant sneered, tapping the image. "Who would have thought a little maid could bring down the king?" His leather jacket creaked as he leaned closer. "By dawn, every rival family will see this stream. They'll know he's weak enough to bleed for a woman." Camille kept her breathing steady, just as she had behind that bar. Her wrists burned where the zip ties bit into them, but she focused past the pain, counting footsteps in the corridor outside. 2 guards, passing every 8 minutes. Their boot heels clicked a distinctive pattern on the concrete. "Could I have some water?" she asked, letting a tremor enter her voice. "And the ties are cutting off circulation. I can't feel my fingers." The lieutenant studied her, then nodded to one of his men. "Check the ties. We need her pretty for the camera." As the guard adjusted the plastic restraints, Camille cataloged the warehouse layout. 2 exits visible, the main door 30 paces ahead, a fire escape behind her left shoulder. High windows showed the river fog pressing against dirty glass. The lamp's electrical cord snaked up to an exposed junction box. Across the city, in a safe house chosen for its medical supplies and sightlines, Salvatore jerked awake on a makeshift operating table. Caleb's steady hands worked at his shoulder, pulling another stitch through torn flesh. "Hold still," the underboss ordered, voice tight with controlled rage. "That bastard Eamon knew exactly where to put the bullet. Half-inch lower and you'd be dead." Salvatore's jaw clenched against the pain. "Burn Ilya's accounts. All of them. Then call Marchetti and Romano. They owe me for Madrid. I want eyes on every dock and warehouse, from here to the river." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Find Eamon. Alive. He dies slow." Back in the warehouse, the lieutenant's phone buzzed. He stepped away to take the call, leaving Camille alone with 2 guards. The zip tie on her right wrist had enough give now. If she twisted against the chair's rough edge, she could maybe... The scene shifted again to the safe house, where Caleb's laptop pinged an alert at 2:40 a.m. "Burner signal, strong hit near Pier 14, old processing plant that went dark last month." Salvatore stood, ignoring how the fresh bandage immediately darkened with blood. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with focused intensity. "Bring me the girl." "Boss, you can barely..." "I said bring me the girl." Minutes ticked by in the warehouse. Camille worked her wrist in tiny movements, feeling the zip tie gradually loosen. Her fingers found a raised screw head on the floor, carefully palming it while the guards checked their phones. At 2:55 a.m., her right hand finally slipped free. She kept her arm still, maintaining the illusion of restraint as the lieutenant stepped out for another call. Blood trickled down her abraded wrist. 10 minutes, she whispered to herself. Just survive 10 more minutes. The fog pressed thicker against the windows, turning the river invisible beyond the glass. Camille's heart pounded, but her mind remained crystal clear, categorizing threats and exits just as she had that first night in the alley. The lieutenant's voice echoed from the corridor, arguing with someone about payment terms and streaming quality. The guards shifted restlessly, hands never far from their weapons. At 3:02 a.m., the single bulb above Camille's head went dark. In the sudden blackness, she heard the guards curse and fumble for flashlights. The warehouse's emergency lights failed to kick in. Through broken windows, the river fog rolled inexorably forward like a living thing, thick enough to swallow sound. Camille's measured breaths seemed unnaturally loud in the darkness. Then came the boots, dozens of them, running on concrete, converging from multiple directions. Orders barked in clipped tones, the mechanical sound of slides being racked. The lieutenant shouted something about the breaker box. A guard's radio crackled with static and cut out. More footsteps pounded, closer now, precise and purposeful. Camille remained absolutely still in her chair, the loose zip tie and palmed screw her secret weapons. The darkness pressed around her like a physical presence as chaos erupted in the corridors. Her ears strained to track the movement, boots to her left, then right, then behind. The fog muffled everything into ghost sounds, making distance impossible to judge. Someone's flashlight beams swept wildly across broken machinery, creating strobing shadows that revealed nothing. The lieutenant's voice rose in panic. "Check the girl! Don't let them!" But his words cut off in the darkness. More running footsteps, more shouted commands, the sound of fists meeting flesh, bodies hitting concrete. Through it all, Camille kept her breathing steady and silent. She could feel the change in the air as multiple people entered the room, moving with practiced efficiency. The darkness concealed them completely, but she sensed their presence, the whisper of tactical gear, the controlled breathing of professionals. The fog continued its inexorable advance through the broken windows, thick enough now to diffuse what little ambient light remained from the city beyond. Camille's world narrowed to sound and touch and instinct as boots pounded closer in the absolute dark. At 3:03 a.m., the darkness erupted into controlled chaos. Glass shattered as Caleb's team breached multiple entry points. Suppressed gunfire cracked through the warehouse like dry branches snapping in winter. The sound echoed off concrete walls, making it impossible to track the sources. Camille dropped and rolled behind her chair as flashlight beams crisscrossed the space. The metal screw dug into her palm, but she held it ready. Boots scraped concrete. Someone's radio hissed static. Through the fog and smoke, she glimpsed the lieutenant's men taking defensive positions behind pillars. A hand grabbed her hair, yanking her up. Cold steel pressed against her throat as the lieutenant used her as a shield. His breath came fast and hot against her ear. She felt his pulse hammering where his arm crossed her collarbone. Through drifting smoke, a figure emerged. Salvatore moved with lethal grace despite his injured shoulder, the bandage dark with fresh blood. His presence filled the space like gathering thunder. When he saw the knife at Camille's throat, he slowly lowered his gun and kicked it aside. "Take me instead," he said, voice steady. "Let her walk, and I'm yours." The lieutenant's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "The great Salvatore Rinaldi, offering himself up for a maid. Santino was right, she's made you weak." The knife bit deeper. Camille met Salvatore's eyes through the haze. In that moment, she saw past his mask to the raw fear beneath. Not for himself, but for her. She moved before conscious thought, twisting in the lieutenant's grip. 3 quick steps brought her to Salvatore. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing close, as if she could shield his heart with her body. His hands came up instinctively to steady her. "Stay still," she whispered against his mouth, making the kiss both declaration and defense. "Let them all see. Let them know this wasn't weakness. It was choice. It was strength." The lieutenant had to adjust his aim around her new position. In that fraction of hesitation, a single shot cracked from the shadows. Caleb's bullet took him high in the chest. He crumpled without a sound. More gunfire erupted as the remaining men tried to retreat. Through the chaos, Ilya materialized from the darkness. He moved like he was backing Santino's crew until Eamon tried to slip past. In one fluid motion, Ilya's knife found Eamon's thigh. "You never understood," Ilya snarled, twisting the blade. "I respect kings who actually protect their queens, not snakes who bite the hand that feeds them." Eamon howled as he went down. The sound echoed off the walls until someone gagged him. The shooting tapered off. Shell casings rolled on concrete. Smoke hung thick in the air, cut by sweeping flashlight beams as Caleb's men secured the perimeter. Salvatore's hands shook as he guided Camille back against a support column. His fingers traced her throat where the knife had been, checking for damage. His breath came warm against her forehead. "You're mine," he said roughly. "Say it." Camille lifted her chin. "Yours," she agreed. "But only if you're mine too." His eyes darkened. The promise hung between them, mutual and binding, as sacred as any blood oath. Distant sirens wailed, growing closer. Red and blue lights began to strobe through the broken windows, reflecting off the fog that still rolled in from the river. 3 minutes to clear, Caleb called. His men moved with practiced efficiency, collecting weapons and wiping prints. Someone zip-tied Eamon's hands and feet. The tablet with the footage lay smashed beyond recovery. Camille looked once toward the river, where foghorns moaned their lonely warning. The water was invisible, beyond the shattered panes, but she could smell its brackish breath. This was where everything changed, where she stopped running and chose to stand. She turned back to Salvatore, who watched her with an intensity that burned through the darkness. When he held out his hand, she took it without hesitation. Caleb appeared at their side. "Back stairs are clear. Cars waiting 2 blocks south. We need to move." They left the warehouse as they'd entered it, like ghosts in the night. But Camille wasn't the same person who'd been dragged in hours ago. That woman had been a captive, a pawn. She walked out on her own feet, hand-clasped with Salvatore's, having chosen her path and her king. The fog swallowed them as they descended the metal stairs, their footsteps fading to whispers. Above the river, the city's lights blurred like watercolors bleeding into black paper. At 3:18 a.m., they vanished into the darkness, not as predator and prey, but as equals who had claimed each other in the face of their enemies. Behind them, Eamon stumbled on bound feet as Caleb's men hustled him toward a different vehicle. His muffled curses were lost in the growing wail of police sirens. The night had more reckonings to deliver, but those would wait for dawn. Pearl gray light washed over the townhouse windows at 6:40 a.m., casting soft shadows across the newly plastered foyer where bullet holes had marked the walls just days ago. Camille stepped through the front door with Salvatore, his arm carefully positioned to protect his bandaged shoulder. Exhaustion painted dark circles under their eyes, but they were otherwise unharmed. The night's consequences had unfolded with swift efficiency. Eamon had been escorted to a place where cameras never reached, where old-world justice would be served without modern interference. Deep in the basement, the former linen's maid sat chained to a chair in a locked room, awaiting Caleb's particular brand of questioning. Ilya's unexpected intervention had been acknowledged with a granite-cold handshake and crystal-clear understanding. Test Camille's safety again, and no business arrangement would save him. Fresh from a shower that had washed away the warehouse's grime, Salvatore stood on the balcony, holding 2 steaming coffee cups. His dress shirt was crisp despite the early hour, though he'd left it untucked, a small concession to his injury. The morning air carried a bite that made the coffee's warmth welcome. Camille joined him, wrapped in one of his cashmere sweaters that draped past her hips. The borrowed clothing felt like a statement. She belonged here now, in his space, wearing his protection like a second skin. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city shrink beneath them as dawn crept higher. "The house protocols have been updated," Salvatore said quietly, his voice still rough from the night. "Your key card now has full access. Caleb approved it himself." She nodded, understanding the weight of that trust. "And the other changes?" "My word is still law outside these walls," he confirmed. "But inside," he turned to face her fully. "Inside, your boundaries become house rules. Anyone who breaks them answers to me." The distinction was clear. Lethal force directed outward to protect what was precious within. His kingdom would reshape itself around her presence, not demand she conform to its existing structure. When the coffee cooled, Camille returned to her guest room, the space that had first sheltered her when proximity was forced rather than chosen. The drawer still held her neatly folded uniform from the club, a reminder of how this began. She touched the fabric once, then closed it with finality. Crossing the hall, she stood in the doorway of his room, their room now, if she chose it. The closet stood open, half empty, waiting. "Yes," he said from behind her, reading her hesitation. "Decide me." She unpacked slowly, deliberately, hanging each piece beside his suits and shirts. The physical integration of their lives felt significant, a choice made in daylight rather than darkness. They settled in his office later that morning, reviewing the practical aspects of their future. The club debt that had first bound her to him had been legally transferred to a clean trust in her name. She would have a real position in the organization, one that reflected her worth beyond domestic service. "The rules protect us both now," he said, sliding papers across his desk. "I won't cage you, but I need to know you're safe." "I understand the limits," she replied, scanning the documents. "No unnecessary risks, no solo ventures into rival territory, regular check-ins when I'm off property. And I'll honor your boundaries in return. No decisions about your life without your input, no locked doors between us, no touches you don't invite." The morning stretched toward 8 o'clock, sunlight now streaming fully through the windows. They returned to the balcony where they'd first truly talked, where he'd shared the story of his brother's death and she'd helped him see that tenderness wasn't weakness. Their coffee cups sat cooling on the rail as Camille took his hand and placed it over her heart. The steady rhythm beneath his palm spoke of life, of presence, of choosing to stay. "We start now," she said simply. "Now," he agreed, the word both acknowledgement and promise. Below them, the household stirred to life. Guards changed shifts at the gates. Kitchen staff began preparing breakfast. Caleb's voice drifted up from the courtyard as he coordinated the day's security rotation. The familiar hum of activity resumed its rhythm, but now without the undercurrent of fear that had marked the past weeks. Salvatore's thumb traced small circles over her heart, as if memorizing its beat. The gesture contained all the gentleness he'd hidden from the world, saved only for her. Here, in the morning light, they had redefined strength, not as the absence of softness, but as the courage to protect it. The city spread before them, a maze of possibilities and dangers they would navigate together. But for this moment, they simply stood in the peace they'd fought to create, letting the sun warm their faces and the promise of now settle into their bones.